4, 3, 2, 1. Can we prevent the Russians from getting technical information that's sensitive to our needs and their needs without hiding it from ourselves and our own academic community? We'll talk about that question next, right here on To the Point.
To the Point. Presented by Rice University.
I'm Scott Hochberg. Welcome to our program. There is a real problem in the academic community and in the military establishment with regard to keeping sensitive information out of the hands of those nations which are our enemies and still allowing the ready access of that information to our own researchers and furthering research in this country that will help us maintain superiority in these particular areas. And that has resulted in some policy changes and many study groups right now which are looking to see if we can keep the two problems from being at odds with each other, to come up with a reasonable solution to them. Dr. Norman Hackerman is president of Rice University, has been since 1971. He's very involved in working on finding a solution to these problems as a consultant to the National Science Foundation and a former board member, a member of the National Academy of Sciences Committee on National Security and Scientific Communication, a member of the Defense Department Forum on University Responsiveness, and just basically involved as an academic and as a chemist. And he is our guest this morning. Welcome to our show. It's good to have you here. Let's just start out by opening up the question, is it not in our national interest to keep technical advances out of the hands of our enemies? Is that not a major, serious problem that we have today?
That's a proper problem, yes.
Okay. In general, what we tend to see in a lot of news reports and news features is a lot of talk about industrial espionage, a lot of talk about people just outright buying secrets. Are we handing over things to the Russians through other means that do not require illegal actions at the present time?
I'm sure that they get information from meetings and from visits to campuses, visits to industrial establishments of some consequence. But the fact is that the principal difficulty has been the transfer of completed technology as contrasted to science, which is by no means completed technology. And it's this transfer of technology that's, I think, has been the big problem. Now, in a rather sometimes too all-inclusive attempt to sweep science and technology into the same bin, which is what most people do, there's been an error made in saying that one has to not only prevent the transfer of completed technology, but also of science.
Let's draw a distinction for the people in our audience who may be sweeping them together. What is the difference between technology and science as you see it?
Well, you'd have to use a small model of mine, Steve. The model uses the three letters in the alphabet, S, T, and U. Science, technology, and ultimate use, for use. The coupling between science and technology is very loose, very fluid, and not at all direct. That is, you can't really see from science to technology. You sometimes can see back the other way, but you can't see forward. So the coupling is very loose, and science is necessary in order for technology to take place. So science is a vital first step. But the piece of science, which is the vital first step for a given piece of technology, is just not evident. Now, the coupling between technology and use, on the other hand, is very direct. And there you can begin to see the path that you're going to use to get to an ultimate usable item. Well, the point is that science, which belongs to everybody, that is, nobody, no nation, no person has a hold on it. It's universal, and it is timeless. It will be discovered today or tomorrow or 50 years from now. It doesn't matter. It's simply something that exists to be known. About the only thing you can do there is get a dynamic step. That is, you can learn about it a little earlier. But learning about it a little earlier doesn't do you any good unless you also have the capacity to produce a recipe that converts it into a useful item.
Okay, so what you're saying then basically is that science is just basically the determination of the finding, the discovery of knowledge, whereas the technology end of it is, all right, you have this knowledge, now do something with it that can benefit you in some way.
That's right. You have to put together lots of bits and fragments and filaments of science and you end up with a technological innovation. And if it's economically or military purposeful, then it becomes useful.
Okay.
Otherwise, it disappears. Now, the problem is that the transfer of everything from the initial science, everything beyond the initial science, I think is clearly a matter of some concern of national security in varying degrees. One of the great problems we have is that we're told that our apparent or potential enemies take our science and convert it into technology faster than we do. Well, we ought to be concerned about that. Why can somebody else take our science, whether they're either potential enemies or our current allies, why can they take our science and convert it so much faster? Must be something wrong with our system which inhibits the conversion, the productivity and the innovation of the science to technology.
Okay. Do you believe that to be true? Do you believe that
Yes,
our
I
enemies
do.
have that ability?
Well,
Okay.
the Japanese certainly
Okay.
have shown that.
So we're certainly
They're not,
trade
not-
enemies.
they're not our enemies.
Right.
They are our allies. The West Germans have shown it. It's not quite as simplistic as I've made it. Obviously, the education of people to be scientists and engineers is very important because they are the translators of science to technology. Most of the translators. Of all the people who are educated in science, only a small fraction stay in science. The rest of them go into the translation business of conversion. And the Germans and Japanese, to a very great extent, have obviously done very well in educating their people, so that that conversion takes place perhaps more readily than it does here now. That's a whole different issue.
Yeah. Let's try and stay on the policy problem here. All right. So where does the conflict come in between protecting our interests and allowing good, healthy academic research?
Okay. The conflict is this. Suppose we were to have on this campus 2 Soviet citizens who worked in one or another research laboratories. And let's say they were working in the materials laboratory. And in the materials laboratory, there was some evidence that one could produce an alloy of consequence. That is, you were doing a piece of pure science to show that the d-electron system was such that you could get a harder or more conductive or softer or whatever you wanted.
Right.
And anybody who had a slight nose for use could detect that. Now suppose a Soviet citizen was in that laboratory at that time, and we assume that he has just the same capabilities as we do. He could detect it, he could pass the information on, and his compatriots could then produce that particular alloy and put it into their tanks or battleships or whatever before we did.
Okay. Why is it, or is it important that we have Soviet people studying in our laboratories?
Well, that's the thing that many people don't quite understand. Universities are based on a collegiality process, which says that you keep no secrets from anybody, that one talks openly about anything that they want to talk about, ideas, concepts, devices, etc. And that has done so very well for us over a period of 100 or so years that it's a little hard to simply accept the fact that you can shut that down and still do just as well. The direct evidence that we would know as much or that we would advance as rapidly that we wouldn't advance as rapidly if we didn't have this collegiality is hard to deduce. But it is clearly the perception of everybody that's ever been in the field that by virtue of the fact that I can talk to my colleagues in my own field, that I'm better for it. And if I talk openly to them about what I know, and they talk openly about what they know, then we'll both make advances that much more rapidly.
Okay, would any of the policy restrictions that have been proposed or put into effect prevent you from talking openly to your colleagues within the United States, for instance?
Not with our colleagues within the United States, no.
Okay.
But it does make a difference. It would, for example, say that I should have no East Bloc students in my lab. It would say, for example, if one of them were in a class of mine, I would have to be careful about what I said. As a specific example, I'm a member of the Electrochemical Society. Been for many years. Been president. I'm currently the editor of its journal. At its meeting in Montreal in late April or early May, I can't remember which, 2 papers were withdrawn suddenly the day before they were to be given because the authors said that their company felt that those papers shouldn't be given because there were going to be foreign nationals in the audience.
Mm-hmm.
The foreign nationals in this case were Asiatics, not Soviets, not Eastern Bloc. And the papers were discussing VISIC, very high-speed integrated circuits. They weren't discussing VISIC itself, but some of the very minute aspect of it. But the company decided to withdraw it. Now, whether they decided on their own legal counsel or whether somebody said, you really oughtn't talk about this, I can't tell you. But I do know that this is a case in which what is a normal open publication was removed very suddenly.
How do other countries handle this problem? Are we the only country that has this abundant free flow of information? Do the Russians willingly share their knowledge with us?
At times they do, and times they don't. It's sort of peripatetic. My contact with the Soviet scientists has, by and large, been very good. When we've talked, there has been apparently no holding back on their part. Mm-hmm. But I can't guarantee that.
Right. Since you are working on these committees, I don't want to try to get you to say anything that would eventually come out in a report that hasn't yet been decided. But as you see the problem right now, what sort of restrictions would you advocate which would protect our legitimate needs and not overly restrict the academic community?
Yeah. I think we'd have to do it on an ad hoc basis. People don't like that. They really would like to have a set of simple rules, 1, 2, and 3, mm-hmm. and this is what you do. I think the ad hoc approach is important because not all areas of science are as easily untwined from technology as I indicated at the beginning. There are some areas where science and technology are so closely intertwined that you really can't distinguish them. Discoveries in certain fields, for example, the genetic engineering field or the genetic conversion field, 20 or 30 years ago is when that started, with Watson and Crick paper, actually in the middle 40s, so it's almost 40 years ago. And it's now got to the point where it's become technology, potentially. But this very high-speed integrated circuits business, 5 years ago, there was nothing. Currently, it's getting very close. Well, currently it is technology. Right. And the difference between learning about circuits and designing them is almost zero. Mm-hmm. That is, you learn them as you design them.
Right. Right.
And in fact, you use computers to do it for you.
Who would you have making the decisions on these different issues?
I sort of drifted, didn't I? The important thing, I think, is that you have to write contracts on the support of science in such a way that where the science and technology is closely intertwined, you'd have to have an arbitration unit, a kind of an arbitration unit, with the power of final decision. That yes, this should be closed, or no, it shouldn't. And all other things ought to be open. For example, contracts or grants that I get from the Defense Department that do photoelectrochemistry, there's no reason in the world to put any kind of restriction on that. So the problem is whether you have blanket restrictions that everything has to flow through a censor before it's published or discussed, or whether you can isolate those few things that are indeed sensitive. I think that's the question we have to answer. I think that's where the decision will
to do that isolation.
That's where the decision will be. Yes.
Okay. Dr. Norman Hackerman, the president of Rice University, has been our guest. It's been a very interesting discussion. I wish we had more time to really get into some of these things and into some of the research you've been doing. Appreciate having you on the program. I'm Scott Hochberg. Join us again next week on To the Point.
To the Point is produced by Information Services in the Language Lab at Rice University.